It's my bittersweet pleasure to welcome you to the last session of our Times of Crisis and Possibility series, exploring pivotal moments in the Jewish experience with JTS faculty and fellows. I just want to take a moment to reflect briefly on what happened with this series. When the pandemic began, we of course began thinking about what we could offer to you, and we came up with this theme of Times of Crisis and Possibility. We gathered, I believe, 7 faculty to teach on this theme from a variety of perspectives, and you showed up and you responded, and it became a 16-session series, and we've reached the last one today. So I wanted to just thank everyone for learning with us. I know some people have come for one session or a few sessions, depending on the faculty member, but a lot of you also have been learning with us almost every Monday. And it's been really meaningful and gratifying for us to kind of put JTS Torah out into the world and see the response and create this learning community on Mondays with you. So it's just precious to us, and I want to make sure you know that we are going to be continuing. We could not drop you. You're with us every Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. So we are going to be continuing with Monday learning, actually pretty much through the calendar year. I want to make sure you know what's coming up next week. So hopefully you should have received it by email. But we are starting a new series in the same time next week, a 4-week series on high holiday related themes. And I want to just clarify that I'm actually going to put it into the chat in case anyone missed it, so you can see the sessions and register. But I want to just make sure you know that this series is designed both for people who are observing the high holidays in traditional ways and for those who aren't. So the themes that we chose are relevant to everyone. So you can see it as an experience, a month-long experience of preparing for the high holidays, or just an experience of kind of delving into serious themes about faith, about forgiveness, faith and lack of faith, forgiveness, moving on from wrongdoing, the struggle of prayer, themes that we think are relevant to virtually all of us. So we hope very much that this Monday group, that you'll stay with us and keep learning with us, and of course feel free to invite friends and relatives. And just a final note, in reflecting on this series, I want to just thank the many members of the community learning team who have been part of this. Tani Schwartz-Herman, Rabbi Tim Bernard, Dr. Elisa Braun, Stacy Firestone, and Lynn Feynman. I think I've hit everyone. And of course, all of the faculty. So thanks to everyone for making this series happen. All right, so just a couple of notes about today. So as I think you know, we will be taking Q&A using the raise hand feature in Zoom. You can click on participants down at the bottom, look for the hand icon. If you want to ask a question, click that icon to raise or lower your hand. Feel free to test it out. If you're participating by phone, you do that by dialing *9 to raise or lower your hand. Rabbi Uhrbach will be teaching for an extended period, and then stopping periodically for questions, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So when it's your turn to ask a question, Tani Schwartz-Herman will call on you by name, and then you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question. You should have received the sources in the email that you got this morning from Lynn with the Zoom link, and I'm not going to introduce Rabbi Uhrbach at length because her bio is right there in the source sheet, but we're so pleased to have Rabbi Jan Uhrbach, who's the director of the Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts at JTS, teaching the last session of our series. And just for continuity's sake, she is teaching the first session of the next series as well. Rabbi Uhrbach, thanks so much for teaching us today. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see so many people. I can't see everyone on one screen, so you'll forgive me if I don't see hands raised and things as you go. But I called this First Failures, Falling Apart and Starting Over in the Book of Genesis. And my hope here is that our learning will not only be responsive to the difficulties of the moment that we're in and the sense of brokenness, of things falling apart, but that it will also begin to be preparation for thinking about the Yomim Noraim and beginning this Shabbat, we announce the month of Elul, and the zealous begin their preparation then. So I'm hoping this will be a little bit of both. So the book of Genesis, Bereshit, is basically, if you look at it as an overview, it's basically a book about failure and brokenness. Whole societies, families, individuals, even God. And it begins at the very beginning. I gave you on the first page of the source sheet, maybe we can pull that up, just so you can see it clearly, visually, beginning with Genesis 1 in the first creation story. God creates a world that seems totally great. God looks and it's good, 6 times good, 1 time very good, all good, hunky-dory. By chapter 2, we discover that's actually not totally true. From a distance, maybe things look terrific. As we zero in on the process of creation, up close and personal, God's first effort at creating the world and creating humanity turns out not to be a complete success. Something is flawed. The garden is lovely, but something is lo tov, not good. The human being is alone. Creation, it seems, already needs a little bit of tinkering. By chapter 6, the whole thing seems to be a disaster. And can we pull that up just so people can see it, just the first page? The whole thing seems to be a disaster. And from chapter 6, all those 6 goods and a very good in chapter 1 to a not good in chapter 2, by chapter 4, it's Rabba Ra'at and Rak Ra, great badness, and nothing but bad all the time. And God regrets, as you can see, and thus the flood. God brings a flood and dissolves everything. We have a cosmic do-over right at the beginning of Genesis. And even that, the wiping out of everything and starting over, turns out to be not exactly the right move. And God sort of learns again and says, okay, we're going to have a new response. I'm not doing that again. I'm not going to wipe out the whole world with a flood anymore. That wasn't the best way to go. The book continues with failures and new beginnings. Right? God begins with Adam. Noah is a new Adam. Abraham becomes a new Noah. We're going to start again. The book is filled with global and national crises and failures, and each of them yields a new paradigm. After the flood, there's the Tower of Babel. Everybody speaks the same language. That turns out not to be so great. We need a new model. We're going to split everybody up. Then there's Sodom and Gomorrah with all the evil, and that gets wiped out. There are famine, there are wars in the lifetimes of both Abraham and Isaac. And of course, the majority of the book focuses on individual crises and failures. In relationship with each other, in broken and failed relationships, the first naturally born human being, Cain, kills the second one, his brother Abel. Fratricide. That fratricide, or a lesser version of it, continues in every single generation. The pattern plays out throughout. Every generation, brothers threaten to kill each other. According to the Midrash, Jacob and Esau do it in utero. Before they were even born, they try to kill each other. And there's familial dysfunction and crisis. There is not one single unbroken, perfect family in the book of Genesis. Not one. Abraham's family of origin splits up. According to the Midrash, his father tried to kill him. He marries Sarah. They create a household. That family can't stay together. Hagar and Ishmael end up banished, and then there's the binding of Isaac, and Abraham and his son Isaac never speak to each other again. Isaac and Rebekah, the next generation, don't really talk to each other so well. There has to be deception. Rebekah and Jacob deceive Isaac. That results in Esau threatening to kill Jacob. Jacob is exiled. Esau becomes a source of bitterness to his parents. The next generation, Jacob and his family, his two wives, Rachel and Leah, there's failed relationships on all sides. Jacob only wants Rachel, he gets Leah. Rachel only wants children, she gets Jacob. Leah only wants Jacob, she gets children. Nobody is happy. The father-in-law, Rachel and Leah's father, is a crook. The whole family has to flee. Jacob's own family falls apart too. The brothers sell Joseph into slavery. Then they lie to their father by omission. It reads like a soap opera. And underneath it all, there are, in every generation, failures of faith, crises of faith, and breaches in the relationship with human beings and God. We know, obviously, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah each have a crisis of faith. Abraham, who's held up as the paradigm of faith, when God says to him, you're going to have a child, right? And God makes a covenant with him. He says to him, somebody, what can you do with me? What can you do for me? I seeing as I go childless. Rebecca has a crisis of faith. Lama ve'anochi, she says, what is this? What is this I? It's an existential crisis. And also some of the commentators read it as anochi with a capital A. What is this I? The I who spoke at Sinai. What is this God? Who is this God? What's going on? Jacob wrestles with the angel. Later in his life, he describes his life, the days of his life, as few and bad. This is the arc of the book. And there are a number of surface lessons we can derive from this. One is that Judaism doesn't offer Norman Rockwell pictures, right? We have no fantasy of what, quote, family values looks like. There is no perfect family. There are no perfect heroes. That makes the Torah more honest, more relevant to us. If everything were perfect, what would I learn from that? Because I'm not perfect, so it would be useless to me. And also more comforting. It gives us a little bit more responsibility also. We don't have the excuse of saying, well, they were perfect and I'm not, so I don't have to role model myself after them. No, we still have to strive. It reminds us that whatever expectations we may have about how life is supposed to be, we are wrong. There is no pattern for a life. There is no timeline that a life should follow. All of the patriarchs and most of the matriarchs are blessed. If there's one thing we learn from this book, it is that for sure, blessing doesn't equal ease. Because none of them have easy lives. And although Genesis focuses on the individual and family, it's intended to be, I think, seen as a microcosm for community, society, and humanity in macrocosm. They parallel each other. This is the nature of human history. Things break. Things fall apart. Human beings are imperfect. And the question that I want to start with, struggling with today is this just the Torah reflecting a lamentable reality of the human condition? It's the nature of human life. We fail. We need to start over. What are you going to do? Or is there something more? And to address that, I want to zero in for the rest of our time on the beginning and the end of the book. I'm going to start with the beginning. We'll go through this beginning part about Genesis 1 and 2. Then I'll break for questions, and then we're going to jump to the very end of the book and the way that the narrative resolves itself at the end. So let's start with the beginning. We saw creation as involving God's failure. And immediately the good becomes not good and then leads to bad, and there needs to be a do-over. The Midrash imagines very provocatively that starts even before the first verse in the Torah. And if you look at the next page, at text number 1 on page 2, There's a midrash from Bereshit Rabbah. It's an early midrash collection, and it begins with the question of why the first verse of the Torah says, or not actually the first verse, why it said the first day of the Torah says, Yehi Erev. It doesn't say Yehi Erev, but rather Vayehi Erev. It doesn't say there was evening on the first day. It says, and there was evening on the first day. What's the and? It's the first day. Rabbi Abahu says, it's the second paragraph, this teaches us that God would go on creating worlds and destroying them until God created this one, saying, this one pleases me. Those others did not please me. Now, this is really quite startling, and it has profound theological implications. Creation itself is a process of trial and error. God created multiple worlds, failed, tried again, failed, and eventually got it right. But on an even deeper level than that, what was right wasn't perfect. The world that pleases God, that one didn't please me, those didn't please me, this one does, is not a world of perfection. It's this world. It's the world of error and correction, of progress through a process of failing and learning from failure. It's a world of evolution and change. It's this imperfect world that will need to be tweaked, in which God will be disappointed and regret that pleased God. Right? That's amazing. Seemingly, the perfect world is either unstable, can't last, or is in some way undesirable. Maybe it's uninteresting. Right? Maybe a world without failure would have just been more of the same. And so what? And in a sense, a perfect world would be less like God, who creates through trial and error. Right? In the flood story, God regrets, vayinachem. And Rashi there, the great medieval Torah commentator, notes two things on this word regret, vayinachem. One is that the word regret is related to the word for comfort. Comfort. Regret and comfort have an etymological connection. And the second thing he notes is that the meaning of regret is to think a different choice, a different thought. To think a different thought, to change one's mind. What is comforting about changing one's mind? It suggests, I think, that knowing is less comforting than learning, even for God. There's something about the process of being able to change what one thinks that offers something that merely knowing something doesn't. Right, you get a do-over, you get to try again. You get to experience something new. You get to change your perspective. And I want to suggest that perhaps God wanted that too. Humanity, we say, is created in the image of God. That's what Genesis 1 says. We are created in the image of God. One way of understanding that is that we are created to be a kind of mirror, not only for our sake, but for God's, to reflect and embody God's oneness refracted into the fullness of humanity in a way that enables God to evolve, to learn, and also to experience desire, to experience a gap and a wanting. A world of perfection leaves no room for the relationship between God and humanity. Partly, of course, because of who we are, right? We are imperfect. How come God, if God were perfect and we were imperfect, there would be a gap? But it's not only that. It's because of who God is, right? It's our imperfection is what enables us to relate to God and enables God to relate to us. But it works in both ways, right? And think about this, the parallel in human relationships. What opens the door to real relationships? As much as it's what we do right, it's what we do wrong. As much as it's what we are filled with and have to offer, it's what we lack and what we need. Right? And as much as it's who we are, it's who we have the potential to become. Think about relationships with people who never change. Think about a relationship that never changes. It starts to die. Right? The model, one model for how this works, one of the main ways that human beings, and specifically Jews, relate to God, the meeting point between a Jew and God, is the Torah. Torah interpretation flourishes on the things that don't sit well. Most creative interpretations of Torah emerge from it's like the irritation from the sand that generates the pearl. That's where the creativity is. We say about when you study Rashi, it's common to say, "My kashi lo Rashi." What bothers Rashi? Something doesn't sit right. If the Torah were a text that was completely smooth, that we could understand on its face, there would be no room for human creativity, and it would be in many ways less holy. And I want to suggest that for this reason, humanity too is created specifically to err and to fail and to start over. That's not a feature of creation that was undesirable. That's a feature that was intentional and desirable. And evidence of that is another midrash, text number 2 here. You can see it on Genesis 1:1. Breshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. 6 things preceded the creation of the world. Right? There's another text about what happened before we get to that Breshit bara Elohim at the beginning of the Torah. God was doing other things. What did God create first? Well, there were 6 things God created and 6 things God thought about creating. But if you jump to the very bottom where I put in bold, Rabbi Ahava ben Rabbi Zera said there was a 7th thing. And the 7th thing was tshuva, repentance. This too was created before the world was created, before the mountains were brought forth, and from that very moment you turn the human being to contrition, to repentance, and you say, repent, children of humanity. That means that the possibility of human repair, which presupposes the need to repair, is not an afterthought. A later correction, because in retrospect, it turned out that human beings made a lot of mistakes and screwed things up a lot. No, it's created in advance because we're created to fail. As Elie Wiesel said, and I can't find this quote in his writing, I could only find it in a book that quotes him. The book is called Sin Agog. It's a new book, came out last year about sin and failure. But Elie Wiesel is quoted there as saying, God gave Adam a secret. Not how to begin, but how to begin again. That's the key. We think about the Garden of Eden. right? Very often we think about the Garden of Eden and unconsciously we're processing it through the Christian lens of original sin. And so we read the whole story that way. It's not actually a Jewish way of reading the story. And in many ways, the disobeying, the human failure of eating of the fruit that God, of the tree that God forbade, is a process whereby human beings become more fully who we're meant to be. Until that moment, we're told that we are created with free will, but exists only in potential. And we know we have free will. Until we do something that is contrary to what God wants us to do, how do we know we can? For all we know, if we were to disobey God, our arm would be stopped, that we would be physically incapable of doing it. Incapable, right? I mean, you think about most other created things, trees and other plants, and they have to be what they're created to do. They can't be other than they are. Human beings are the only ones who can fail to be fully human, right? But we don't know that until we disobey. And so by that process, we actually acquire free will. And in doing that, the consequence of this first failure are a few things. One, we become in some ways a little bit less like God, right? Because we become mortal. And I want to suggest that that's a process whereby God's original thought, I'm going to make a human being who is going to be in my image, and it's going to be this creature that's going to live together and be kind of a partner and a playmate and a chavruta, a learning partner, and all these things with me. Turns out, no, maybe it's better not to have a single species that lives forever, a single individual that lives forever. Maybe it's better to have a species. So I'm going to introduce mortality and I'm going to introduce childbirth. Okay? So now, as human beings evolve and grow like God, we have to do it over multiple generations. It's not going to happen in one lifetime. We do it over time. But at the same time, we become more like God in other ways. We become creators like God, right? We become co-creators of ourselves. We have to turn ourselves into the people we're meant to be. We become co-creators of a next generation through the process of childbirth. We become like God, knowing. What do we know? Specifically, God says the human has become like one of us, lada'at tov vara. We acquire an intimate relationship with both good and bad. And this is like God. God, too, has an intimate relationship with good and bad, with success and failure, we might say. And we experience shame. And this turns out to be the great complicating factor. I want to suggest, and I'll spell this out in part 2 after we stop for questions, that it's the shame associated with failure and not the failure that turns out to be the biggest problem, right? Shame in the Garden of Eden is associated with nakedness and exposure, with things being revealed and exposed that the human wants to see, wants covered. Right? And the word for shame is very close to the word for clothing. Very interesting. Shame is bush, clothing is lavush. Both of them have that bet and shin. It's the human being feels shame over nakedness. Toward the end of the story there, God clothes the human being. But the moment when God realizes that or speaks to Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, about shame, God says, "Who told you you were naked?" And Rashi has a very interesting comment there. Rashi has, "Me'ayin lecha lada'at ma boshet yesh be'omed arum." Literally, you would translate, "From where are you to know what shame there is in standing naked. God seems to be saying, according to Rashi, to Adam and Eve, how do you know? Not that you're naked. Everybody knows if they're naked or they're not. But how do you know that it's shameful to be naked? But there's another way of reading Rashi's commentary if you punctuate it a little bit differently. You could read, Me'ayin lecha lada'at. You know from nothing. Ma boshet yes be'amod arum. What shame is there in standing naked? Why does the fact that I see you in your fullness cause you to want to hide? Why? What shame is there in that? Somehow we learned, because the shame here of nakedness, of being revealed, I don't think it's really about physical nakedness. It's about the things in us that we are embarrassed to see seen. And somehow we learned that the fullness of our humanity, our failure, our error, being wrong, is a source of shame, and it should be covered over. What if that's the main source of our error? What if that's the biggest mistake we make? What if to emulate God is not to be perfect, but to be openly evolving, to be willing to openly acknowledge that we've made mistakes and we're still trying and we're a work in progress? What if the most godly thing that we could ever do is to say, I was wrong, I'm sorry. And somehow we got that wrong. So I'm going to stop here and take questions. And then we're going to go into the patriarchal narratives and look at brokenness there and one instance of how it resolves. So let me stop here. Tani, are there?
Okay, Leonard Groupman.
Let's see. I don't know why you're not seeing me, but in any case. Okay. Thank you very much. Two quick questions. First, I wanted to just comment about the Breshit, or the whole Hebrew Bible, as God's coming to understand himself, which is the thesis of Jack Miles's book.
Yes.
On God and autobiography, or God autobiography, whatever. So I just thought interesting to bring that up. An ex-Jesuit, of course. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about his, or any comments about his book and his writing. And the other one is on the origins of shame, which you bring up towards the end. What's the answer if you read Rashi, not the way the second way of reading him, but the first? Because it is kind of a mystery what the origins of shame are. How did they know to feel shame under those circumstances? A question which may have a parallel millennia later in Freud's puzzle about the origins of guilt.
So they're both great questions. That's the first one. I can't really answer it because I'm actually in the middle of Miles's book right now. So I'm not all that far into it. So without having read the whole thing, I can't really comment on it. But I mean, clearly you're right that that's his thesis as well. And there are others. I mean, the idea that God is looking to learn through humanity is certainly not original to me. And as to the second question about if we're going to read Rashi as a straightforward question, like where actually did you learn this? The answer is I don't know, and I want to stay with my reading and not go too far afield into other readings, because I know I've raised a lot of provocative stuff just in what I've said. It's a legitimate question on its own, but I think I'd like to stay with this alternative reading.
Leah?
Hi, I'm Leah. Thank you so much for this. It's amazing. I just wrote a bunch of questions and then I'll just mute and listen. I wanted to know, does failure automatically lead to suffering? Is suffering strictly a human concept? Where does the concept of suffering come from, and what is the Jewish perspective on this? Does shame cause the suffering, and can you address the Jewish concepts of faith and trust in God?
Okay, so those are some big questions.
10 words or less.
Yeah, all right. So let me try to at least get a little bit into that.
Okay.
So I am not one who would ever say, and there are many different perspectives on suffering within the Jewish tradition. I am not one to say that suffering is only the result of an internal phenomenon, whether it's caused by shame or whether it's caused by, in the Buddhist sense, of attachment. And I having been by as a congregational rabbi, I've been by too many bedsides and to say that suffering is only the result of our own attitude toward it, and seen too much loss and grief in too many families to ever hold that view. What I will say is that our internal state is sometimes a cause of our suffering, and certainly also sometimes can increase our suffering. With respect to error and failure, sometimes when we err, there are real consequences to our actions and errors that we can't fix, that cause substantial loss and pain and suffering. And it's not only our shame about it, but our shame compounds it. And a great deal of suffering, psychic suffering, and sometimes acting out in ways that hurt other people is driven by shame. I happen to think that shame is one of the great motivating factors of hateful behavior and violence in the world. One of the reasons why people feel they want to hurt other people is because of inner shame. So I'm a big believer in teaching about shame and confronting it and learning to manage it and wrestle with it. And which is not to say, by the way, that shame doesn't also that there isn't a healthy, useful purpose for shame. Sometimes it can keep us from doing bad things. Sometimes, one of the things I lament in this world is that we seem to be divided between unhealthy relationships to shame on two sides, either internalizing and being unable and having too much shame that we're unable to manage, or being kind of shameless in a way, and being shamed by nothing. One of my favorite poems is by William Butler Yeats. It's called To a Friend Whose Work Has Come to Nothing. And it's a poem about failing. And in the poem, he says, "For how can you compete with one who, were it proved he lies, were shamed neither in his own nor in his neighbor's eyes?" Right? So I'm not here to argue that that shame is a bad thing. I do want to argue that shame over failure or mistake can be problematic. So let me stop there because I know let's take one more. I didn't get to faith. That's, I think, a huge question, and I'm going to deal with it next week. So let's bracket that one. I'll take one more and then I'll continue.
Okay, Carolyn?
Hang on.
Hi, Carolyn. Oh, you're muted now.
Unmute. What?
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, something's wrong with my reading of the red line, whether it means I'm muted or I'm not muted. I just was wondering on this whole issue of shame. It's one thing when you're talking about personally and recognizing that that somebody feels shame. But when you're in a relationship in particular, one person may view something as shameful that the person who is viewed by another as being a shameful behavior doesn't view it that way themselves. Then how do you ever get to moving forward with correction?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an extensive discussion about the nature of tshuva in personal relationships and how we and how we work that out. I want to distinguish between something that is wrong and something that is shameful, right? I mean, when we think about shameful in how we judge others, that's a complicated thing, and I would say that in many ways, as we'll get to when we get to the end of the presentation, one of the best ways of dealing with shame is shining light on it. Right? One of the problems with shame is that it's the things that we don't talk about. It's it's the areas where we can't discuss them, we can't learn about each other, we can't explore them together, and so they remain unspoken, and therefore there's no possibility of resolution. And I would say, you know, we all have decisions to make about who we're in relationships with, and what our bright lines are about conduct that we would say, you know, this is something I just can't accept. There are, you know, like murder or things like that. But it's hard to respond in the abstract without a real context. So let's look at a context. Let's look at one. I think that's maybe a good way to go. So I'm going to go back to we're going to move from creation to the patriarchal narratives. And I want to just highlight a couple of things about our namesakes in the patriarchal narratives. One is Abraham, who is known as Avram HaIvri. Ivri, and Ivri is the root of Ivrim, Hebrews. So to the extent that we're known as Hebrews, it comes from Abraham being called the Ivri. Rashi says Ivri says because he came from the other side of the river. Midrash says it's a form of being countercultural, right? That the whole world was on one side and Abraham was on the other side. I want to highlight also that the word Ivri is related to the word Avira, transgression. And it comes from this notion of crossing over, of crossing a boundary. And I am certainly not here to say that the main thing about being Jews is transgressing a lot, right? That's not our goal. But there's an amazing little teaching by Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was teaching in the late 19th century in Germany, often considered the father of modern Orthodoxy. And one of the things he says, it's a long text, so I didn't give it to you, but just to summarize, what he says is that, of course, it's sinful to have no boundaries and go way over the line and do things that are prohibited. But he says that we also sin when we don't go up to the line in the realm of the permitted. When we lead a life that is too constricted and we don't take advantage of the bounty of creation and live a life of joy and fullness because we're so afraid, right? And we don't fulfill everything we could fulfill, that's also a sin. And that suggests that to be an Ivri is kind of to live on the boundary. And if you're going to live on the boundary, inevitably you're going to cross over it from time to time. And we're going to make mistakes on one side or the other. We're going to cross over and transgress, or we're going to not go far enough and sin by being too constricted. That's our first namesake. The second namesake in the Torah is Jacob, who becomes Yisrael. And we're known, obviously, as Israel after Jacob. He gets that name in a process of wrestling with some unknown being. It may be his own guilt and himself. It may be God. It may be whatever he's wrestling with. And he's wounded in that. And the name Yisrael comes from this notion you have striven with being, with beings, human and divine, and have prevailed. You won. Right? You wrestled and you won. But the winning, the prevailing, isn't really prevailing. What it is refusing to let go of the struggle until it yields its blessing. That's what Jacob says. I will not let you go until you bless me. The prevailing is just resilience. He ends up wounded. Did he win? I don't know. It ended kind of in a tie. And he walked away limping. Right? But he stayed in the struggle. It's not about winning. It's as much about failing and getting the blessing from it. And I want to say that Jacob is chosen for the covenant in contrast to Esau. We don't have to demonize Esau. Esau's not a terrible person. But Esau is, in his name, Ibn Ezra says, Esau is Asui. You can read it, you can pronounce it as Asui. Asui means fully made. The Midrash says that Esau came into the world kind of like as an almost, like a full young man with a lot of hair and like full featured. He didn't look like a baby. He was like fully formed, right? And it turns out that being fully formed is not desirable. What's desirable about Jacob is that he evolves. Esau never changes. He is who he is. It's not terrible. That's not the covenantal blessing. And now I want to focus in for the rest of our time and zero in on our third namesake. And that is Yehuda. We are Yehudim. We are Jews. And that comes from Yehuda. We first meet Yehuda in Genesis 29, when we learn that Leah gives birth to her fourth son and says, this time, Odeh et Adonai. This time I will thank God. And so the Torah says she called his name Yehuda, Odeh, from lehodot, gratitude. I will thank God. That is the last we hear of Yehuda for many chapters. The story continues. We learn a little bit about number 1 son Reuven. We learn a little bit about numbers 2 and 3 sons Shimon and Levi. Not a word about Yehuda, the fourth son, until Genesis 37, verses 26 to 27. We are in the middle of the story, ostensibly about Joseph. Joseph gets a lot of airtime in this story. I want to suggest the story is every bit as much about Yehuda, who's the real hero. We know already by this point, Isaac favored Esau, Rebekah favored Jacob. That didn't work out so well. You would think that by now Jacob would have learned about favoring children, but no. Jacob, you can't give what you don't have, my mother used to say, right? And Jacob did exactly what he learned from his father, and he passed on the problem with favoritism. He blatantly, obviously favors Joseph. As a result, the brothers hate him. They're ready to kill him. Reuven steps up, don't kill him, just throw him in a pit. Great idea. That's what they do. They sit down, they have a meal. At this point, Yehuda emerges, and he has a brainstorm. Great idea, chacham that he is. And he says, what do we gain by killing him? Let's just sell him to the Ishmaelites. Sell your brother into slavery. Why not? And he says, don't hurt him, because after all, he's our brother, flesh of our flesh. Not so impressive at this point in his life, I would dare to say, right? Meantime, Joseph disappears. They take his precious coat that they'd stripped him of. They dip it in goat blood. They present it to their father. And they say to him, and this is important, Hakerna, recognize. Is this your son's tunic or not? Vayakira. Yaakov recognizes, yep, that's Joseph's, and he grieves. So Jacob, already widowed of his beloved wife Rachel, is now bereaved of his beloved son Joseph. And now the narrative takes a turn. And unexpectedly, in this story that seems to be about Joseph, all of a sudden we learn about Yehuda. And I gave you the whole chapter. I'm going to summarize quickly, but it's chapter 38. It's on page 5. If you just, I don't think you have to put it on the screen if you just want to look at it. Jacob descends. Yehuda descends. He goes down. That's how the chapter begins. Vayered Yehuda. And he is about to fail big time and to remake himself and start over big time. We learn at the beginning of the story, Yehuda has married, he has 3 sons. Probably he's not the best father because the older 2 sons don't turn out too well. They displease God, they both die. There's a daughter-in-law, had been married first to one then the other. Her name is Tamar. Yehuda treats her very badly. He deceives her. He says to her, stay, wait, be a widow, go back to your father's house, live in limbo until the 3rd son, who happens conveniently to be named Shelah, which means hers, belongs to her, until he comes of age. But he's lying. He has no intention of letting her marry the 3rd son. Time passes, his wife dies. Now he's like his father. He's bereaved of a wife and not 1 but 2 sons. Tamar, meantime, is no fool. She sees that Yehuda isn't going to make good on his promise, and she sits at a crossroads. It's called Petach Einayim. Eye opener is what it means. The opening of the eyes, right? And she conceals her identity so that Yehuda can't what? Recognize her. There's going to be a theme here. Recognize. Haker now. Recognize. He can't recognize. He assumes, not recognizing not only her, his daughter-in-law, but perhaps her humanity. He assumes she must be a prostitute. So he negotiates an assignation, and in payment, he offers, I'll send a goat. She says, good. I want surety. Eravon. Surety. That's going to come up later too. Eravon. I want surety. In advance, give me your seal, your cloak, your staff. He says, good, fine. All good. Later, he tries to send the goat, and his servant can't find her. So what does he do? He kind of throws up his hands. Oh, well, what are you going to do? Let her keep the surety. She can keep my seal and my cloak and my staff, because if we go around looking for her, we'll become objects of derision. As Rashi says, the matter will become publicized and we will be disgraced. There's shame here. Meantime, take a look now at verses 24 through 26. It's on page 8, if you want to look at it in the booklet. So Yehuda says, let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. About 3 months later, Yehuda was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry. We know this is Yehuda's child. Bring her out, said Yehuda, and let her be burned. As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she added, Hakerna. Recognize these. Right? So she sends a message to Yehuda, exactly what the brothers had said to the father. Recognize. Now, the issue of recognize here is much more than recognize, do these things belong to you? These are 3 symbols of his identity. His seal, his staff of authority, his cloak. And what she's really saying to him is, Are you going to own up to who you really are or not? Look at yourself and recognize. And what happens? In verse 26, Vayakir Yehuda. Yehuda recognized. Vayomer tzadka mimeni. He said, she is more right than I. And look what the text does very subtly. Inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. What he's doing here is amazing. He recognizes not only, oh, the child is mine, it was my fault, she shouldn't be burned, but, and I wronged her even before that. I treated her badly. I behaved badly. This is the turning point in the entire story from Genesis 37 to the end of the book. This is the moment when it happens, when Yehuda transforms himself. And if you go back to page 3, I gave you a little midrash. This is from the Talmud, text number 7 from Masechet Megillah. Our rabbis taught some portions of scripture of the Torah are both read and translated. Some are read but not translated, meaning there are certain passages of the Torah, they make us a little uncomfortable. We're not going to skip them, but maybe we shouldn't translate them. Better people don't actually hear. If they're not so learned, they won't know, right? We'll read them aloud, not going to translate them. We don't have to emphasize them. And then they go through and they explain. And this is a text that is listed. The following are read and translated. Yes, you might think this is one that we shouldn't, but we do. Which one? The story of Tamar and Yehuda is both read and translated. Of course, you might think that we shouldn't translate out of respect for Yehuda. You might think that this is a story that puts him to shame. On the contrary, no. We're told this is no objection. The passage redounds to his credit because it records that he confessed. There's no reason to hide the mistake and the correction. That's to his merit. There's no shame here. The shame would have been his failure to acknowledge, right? And this transformation sets up the healing of the multi-generational rift in the family. The final confrontation between Yehuda and Yosef, who is now disguised, Joseph, unrecognizable, as Pharaoh's right-hand man, right? Every generation since Cain and Abel, brothers have fought and threatened to kill each other. This story, there's a turning point. The first turning point is in text number 11. I gave it to you. It's in Genesis 43, when Joseph is manipulating the brothers and Shimon has been kept back in Egypt and there's a famine and Jacob doesn't want to send the brothers down with Benjamin as Joseph, dressed as Pharaoh's right-hand man, wants him to do. And Reuven, not the swiftest knife in the drawer, stands up and says, send him with me. If he doesn't come back with me, you can kill my sons. To which Jacob basically says, don't be an idiot. How would that happen? If I lose my son, now you're gonna comfort me by killing my grandsons? What? Like, how is that helpful, right? And then Yehuda stands up. And Yehuda says, send him with me. I will stand surety for him. E'ervenu. Right? He has this time, he will make good on the surety that he left in the hands of Tamar. Same word. It's from here. It's the same word. All Israel are responsible one for another. Eruvin. Right? We are all sureties for each other. This is where it comes from. I will do that. And so Jacob sends him. We know the drama of the story. Right? Joseph makes a false accusation against Benjamin and he seizes him. And then finally, Vayigash Yehuda. Yehuda draws near and he confronts Joseph. I have always wondered whether he on some unconscious level knows that it's Joseph, whether he recognizes beneath the disguise and isn't really aware. He draws near. Now, what is this drawing near? On page 3, I gave you a text from Genesis Rabbah. It's one of my favorites. Vayigash Yehuda, text number 8. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nehemiah, and the rabbis commented. One said he came for battle. The second said he came for conciliation or appeasement. And the third says he came for prayer. All three of these play out in the way the Midrash imagines this conversation. The book of Breshit emphasizes failure and brokenness and repair. No one said it would be easy. Judaism is not big on cheap grace, either from God or from other people. And here, all three, battle, prayer, conciliation, come into play. The Midrash portrays this incredibly rage-filled, furious, almost violent confrontation when Yehuda approaches Joseph. It's always what makes me think he actually knew. He's enraged. They describe it in long, long detail. And then Joseph becomes enraged. And they describe it as this massive battle, like between two lions. Right? Battle. And then there's prayer. Lehit Palel, which Rav Hirsch says is about self-judgments, introspection, accountability before God, recognizing the self, and conciliation, seeing, recognizing the other, and seeing their point of view. Right? This kind of stuff doesn't happen easily. There's anger, there's rage, there's fighting. There's a need for quiet reflection. There's a need to really see each other. It is hard. That's the model. You have his whole speech. I want to zero in on one moment, which I always think, all kinds of interpretations, what causes Joseph to break down? What is it about what Yehuda says that makes him reveal himself? I think it's one key moment, and I want to zero in on verse 27. It's on the second to last page of your text. He's telling the story, Yehuda, before this figure that he doesn't know, or maybe he knows, is Joseph, and he's telling the whole story and what his father said. And we said, in verse 26, we answered to Jacob, our father, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us can we go down, for we may not show our faces to the man unless our youngest brother is with us. And then he says, your servant, my father, Jacob, said to us, as you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone from me. And I said, alas, he was torn by a beast, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you will send my white head down to Sheol in sorrow. Why do I think this is so important? Because Yehuda is acknowledging aloud probably the single most painful, shameful fact of his life. My father said, my wife bore me 2 sons. Reality is Jacob had 4 wives. He had 12 sons. And what Yehuda is acknowledging here is, we have all known. We've never talked about it, but we all know. In our father's eyes, there was only ever one wife, and it wasn't my mother. And there were only ever really 2 sons, and I wasn't one of them. Can you imagine? You know, there are so many moments like this in the Torah. We all feel for Esau when he says, have you but one blessing, Father? But imagine being Jacob. I have to dress up to be my brother in order to get my father's blessing. This is that moment for Yehuda. There was one wife. It wasn't my mother. He never really loved her. And I was never as full a son as Joseph and Benjamin were. And here he is in this moment to save that very Benjamin, just acknowledging it publicly, openly for everyone to hear. And I think that's the moment when Joseph realizes he's really changed. And this is now a family when maybe we can start to talk about shameful things, right? So Yehuda models for us here, owning the brokenness, confronting the shame, and the rest of the narrative models for us accepting and celebrating partial healings and partial resolutions. Is the family perfect after this? No. Right? The Torah does not give us half-hour sitcom endings where everything resolves. This is the work of generations. It will take until Moses and Aaron to see a pair of brothers who genuinely love each other without competition. It doesn't happen in this generation. But to come back to where we started and Yehuda's name, lehodot, Yehuda means gratitude. It also means to acknowledge, and it means to confess. What we will do on Yom Kippur is called a vidui. It's the same root as lehodot, as Yehuda's name, as our name. To be a Jew is to be grateful, yes. To be a Jew is also to acknowledge and to confess, to recognize oneself and own up to it. And there's another neat little feature of Yehuda's name, which is that it is a combination of lehodot and Yud-He Vav-He, the name of God. Right? It has the Dalet in it from lehodot. If you take out the Dalet, it reads Yud-He Vav-He. Because in this acknowledgement, confessing of error, in failing and starting over, we are in God's image and God is in us. Right? And the offspring of Yehuda and Tamar, the offspring of that moment of treating someone badly, of acknowledgement of the wrong, produces the line of Messiah, right? That comes from the line of that union of Yehuda and Tamar. And I want to close and leave time for questions with just a couple of other texts that food for thought as you begin to think about the High Holy Days. So if you look at page 2, text number 3 and 4 are some classic texts about error, and they're wonderful texts to think about in terms of the High Holy Days. The first is from the Masachet Brachot in the Talmud, in the place where Ba'alei Tshuva stand, in the place where the people who do repentance stand, even the holy righteous do not stand. This is a way of saying we are in a higher place before God when we have failed and started over than if we never failed to begin with. And then text number 4, also from the Talmud, from Masachet Gittin. I'll skip the proof text. Look at the quote at the end. Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said, "A person cannot stand on, fulfill, or truly understand the words of Torah unless one has first stumbled in them." Right? It's a practical teaching. We learn from mistakes, but it's a deeper teaching than that. The essence of Torah is failing and owning. And I wanted to just close with one of my favorite poems for this time of year. You have it on page 4. This is a poem by Merle Feld from her book, Finding Words. And maybe it'll open some recognition for us in preparation for the High Holy Days. The door closes. The last time we met, I wish the sun had been shining. I wish I had been as gentle with you as with my babies still wet from the womb. I wish I had better understood what you were saying underneath the words and addressed myself to those underneath words. I wish you had seen me once more, a soft woman worthy of trust, full of affection and respect. Instead, you saw what? Someone angry, demanding, dangerous. Instead, we sparred, your heart on guard as if we had never trusted. But then the moments when your eyes were full, they were saying something. What? I was so tight, intent on stories, pulling out of you stories I thought I needed, deserved, stories that seemed important. Instead, I should have asked, what are your eyes saying? A missed meeting is someone's fault, isn't it? And the temptation is great to blame, conclude the fault was his. If only he hadn't fought me, if only he had given what I asked for, and the pain is great to imagine. The mistakes were mine. If not for me, it all would have turned out beautifully. So we have a little time for just a couple of questions, maybe.
Okay, Sherry?
Hi. I really like this latter part very much because I think it may have headed towards exactly what I was thinking in certain ways. The book of Torah is not just dysfunctional families. I mean, there have to be functional families too, and to see them, well, of course, it would be interesting to see how they function so well. But what especially you've said at the end is meaningful because it shows how the dysfunctional families can resolve issues.
Yes.
I think that's an interesting highlight of it all. Because, we can't all be perfect. We can't all be, and it isn't always perfect. But so what?
Right.
But the bottom line is, given what we have, what can we do with it? And we do have the ability to do with it, to act, to function. I'm sorry. I had a lot more thoughts, and I apologize for not.
No need to apologize.
But
and I would say,
what I'm saying.
The Torah obviously is not only about dysfunctional families, but overwhelmingly the families presented are broken, right? I mean, it gets a little bit better in Exodus, but overwhelmingly the Torah does not present us with models of families that stay intact. Overwhelmingly. Now, that doesn't mean we should emulate that. It means we should learn from it, but it is a way of acknowledging that it's not that that we can't all be perfect. It's that none of us can be perfect.
Well, we can work for it.
We strive, but it's the striving. Yes, exactly. Maybe one more, and then if anyone wants to stay a little longer, I'm happy to do that.
You. And since we're so close to the end, I'll call on one more, and then I just wanted to thank Rabbi Jan Uhrbach so much, and we'll also have the opportunity to learn with her next week at the start of our High Holiday series as well. So thank you, Rabbi Uhrbach.
You.
And I am going to call on Paul.
Hi. Just as I was typing something, that's been my day, my week, actually. Oh, sorry. I wanted to return to Genesis, if it's all right, to ask what oh right. What meaning, wow, 1 second. What meaning, what meaning, what purpose was the original context and like narrative context, the original context meaning involved in Genesis, the Garden of Eden. I guess you said it's contrasting our quote unquote heavily Christian apologetic world So what appears to be the original context?
Are you referring to what I said, that we tend to read the story of the Garden of Eden through the lens of the Christian notion of original sin?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that, I don't know that I would say it's the original. It's just that the way that the Jewish tradition doesn't read it so much as original sin that gets, certainly not one that gets, that is then kind of genetically passed down to us. It's a much richer and more nuanced reading than that, along the lines, my favorite reading, along the lines of what I talked about, that in many ways it was God's intent that we would do that, right? That it was a necessary part of human development that we would disobey the command and thereby become fully human with agency and free will and responsible for our own moral development. That absent that, the world would have been less complete. And, in some ways, if you think about it, anybody who's ever tried to discipline children knows that the one thing that that if you're going to get kids to do what you don't want them to do is to say, you can do absolutely anything except this one thing, right? Don't look in that closet. Don't eat this one thing. Don't do, they're going to do it. But it's like the setup in the Garden of Eden is so almost absurd that, that it had to have been part of the plan, as opposed to the way that Christianity, interpreted it as original sin. I have to say, I love your T-shirt, by the way, which is a play on the verse that I quoted, "Rock, rock," right?
Well, actually,
rock. It's great.
Also in Hebrew.
Yeah, I know. So it's a great shirt.
Yeah. So in a sense, the Christian world tends to cry about that narrative, while we're supposed to actually own up to it and learn from it.
I don't want to oversimplify the Christian view, but I'll certainly embrace, yes, we're supposed at least according to one reading. Within Jewish tradition, there's always multiple readings. I would never say this is the Jewish reading, but mostly, yes, we lament it less and embrace it more. I think that's fair.
I just want to jump in, just since we're past the end of our formal time, but thank you for staying for additional questions. But I just wanted to, all those who are still on the call, which is a lot of people, I just wanted to let you know, clearly this theme of failure and acknowledging, kind of baldly acknowledging our failure, it really resonates with people. And so I want to make sure that you all know that the fourth session in our High Holiday themed series, which I'm actually teaching, is very much on this topic, on how our biblical and rabbinic ancestors understood wrongdoing in the world, what the effect was on the world when we sin, when we make mistakes, and what do we do to restore equilibrium and move on. So it seems like that topic will resonate with this group, so I just wanted to mention it. So this is kind of the official end, but thank you, Rabbi Uhrbach, so much for teaching, for closing the series, and for staying for additional questions. And thanks again to everyone for joining us for this learning.
Thank you.
Rabbi Uhrbach, do you have time for additional?
Sure, we can go a little longer if people want to.
So I know we had a question from Naomi. 1 second, I'm just going to ask her to unmute. Naomi, are you?
Yes, I just unmuted. Okay. Speaking from Israel, by the way. So
welcome.
What I would like to just really, first of all, thank you so much for your amazing interpretation of, Kishnayim Yaldali Ishti. I mean, I think, I don't know if that's your own or if you got the idea from someplace else. And if you did get it from someplace else, please let me know, because I definitely want to quote you on that. So that's one thing. But just to back that up, what's really fascinating is later on, in contrast to Judah, when Judah, all along, Judah has been talking about anachnu, Avdacha Avinu, we, everything is we. And then when Joseph in chapter 45 says, Vayomer Yosef el Echav, Ani Yosef ha'od avi chai. Now I noticed that because first of all, we all say Od Avinu chai. There's the Karl Bach song. We all sing that, right? So it's glaring when we see Od Avi chai. It shows that it backs up your statement that also in Joseph's eyes, it's Avi, it's my father, not like everyone, it's Avinu. And it's amazing that in the liturgy later on, they change it to Od Avinu Chai in the Rosh, I think it's the Rosh Hashanah Machzor. I mean, it's changed because it's so glaring. It shows his own, his own problems. I mean, Joseph is a problematic topic. Anyway, I just thought, thank you, first of all, so much for your interpretation. And then you have the contrast of Joseph, his solipsism that hasn't changed, going back to all his dreams at the beginning, and it hasn't changed. And it's fascinating in contrast to Judah, who does change. And that's your whole theme, is that just like God changes, Judah changes. And so it's a wonderful wrap up. And thank you so much for this.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great point. Let me, the first. I'm reluctant to say that it's mine. I'm sure I heard that interpretation somewhere, but I'm not sure where. As sometimes happens, like things just become part of your consciousness. So I don't want to claim it, but I can't credit it either. But in that moment of Avi, that Joseph says is a great point, and it emphasizes a couple of things. One is that Yehuda really does become the hero. Like he supersedes Joseph as the hero of the narrative very much, and also highlights that the Torah does not give us easy resolutions. The story would be so much less meaningful and less true if there was this revelatory scene and then everybody lives happily ever after, because life doesn't work that way, right? This is the beginning of a process, and Joseph does change somewhat over the course of the narrative. He does, and in some ways he doesn't, and the relationships heal, and in some ways they don't. And as that's where I ended. It's a partial healing, but that's part of the nature of it, right? It's not only it's a parallel in a sense to God destroying the world with the flood, and then saying, okay, that wasn't a final solution. That's not the best way to go either. I'm not going to do that again. It's a constant process of evolution, and we shouldn't expect that when we fail and repair, that there isn't always going to be more work to do. The repair doesn't have to be perfect either. It's not going to be. So it backs that up beautifully, that there's still a little bit of like, maybe he's a little Zetz there. He's my father, not yours, right? And whether consciously or not. Any other, I don't know how, I know people may need to go, but we can take maybe one or two more.
Okay, we have a question from Avi.
Yes, thank you. I had a question with Isaiah, when you have the Ephraim and Manasseh ganging up on Judah. Is that an undoing of all of this process that you've discussed?
Is it an undoing? I mean, it's on the national level, right? So it becomes, there's always the personal and the national are kind of parallels, but they're not identical.
Right.
And I don't know that it's an undoing so much as a repetition of a conflict that needs to be resolved again. I think sometimes, one of the points that I wanted to make is that this work is multi-generational, right? That part of the nature of one of the implications of the fact that the failure is built into creation and that we are now a species is that the repair is multi-generational. And the metaphor that I like to use to think about it is that history, whether we're talking familial history or national history or human history, it's not circular. It's kind of like a spiral. We keep going over the same ground. And hopefully we're doing it at a different level. And hopefully we're doing it either deeper or higher. And sometimes there's regression, but we revisit the same turf. And so the reunion of these brothers is not only imperfect, but it's not permanent. There's going to be fights again on the national level, and then they're going to need to come back again. And so you see that in the prophets, and you see both the fight and the promise of the reconciliation. You see, for example, in Ezekiel 38, just after the story of the dry bones, what's going to revivify the people of Israel is the bringing together of the two sticks of Yehuda and Yosef. So this is then, we read it both on the personal level and as emblematic of a symbolic nationally. I don't know if that answers.
Thank you. No, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Rabbi Uhrbach. I don't see any other questions
Okay.
right now. So
Great.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you all, and a Shana Tova in advance to everybody.